Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Romanello, and I'm a research associate at the German Archaeological Institute, and also postdoc at the PFL, École Polytechnique de Lausanne, in the DH. So I'll talk today about the extraction of canonical references. So we are not moving far away that much from what Chris has just talked about, but more towards how do we actually extract automatically canonical references from text. Until now, I've been working mostly with the 5 main European languages. So today, I really took this workshop as a sort of provocation, and I tried to do a bit of an exercise, seeing what would actually take to do more languages, to move a bit this extraction of references towards a more global philology scenario. So I will start going a bit into the technical details of how do you actually capture them from text automatically. We showed that then a couple of examples of possible applications that are useful, I think, for scholars and students that you can build on top of this. And I will then describe three scenarios going from the easiest, although it's not very easy, to the hardest for going towards a global philology perspective. So first of all, just a slide to say what is out of scope for me. So what I'm not focusing on, I'm focusing only on canonical text. So text that can be cited according to some kind of a logical citation scheme. For poetry, book and lines. For prose, you have books, chapters, and sentences, or paragraphs. And then you have some special cases, like, for example, Aristotle, that I will show in a couple of slides. What I'm not actually doing, but of course would be lovely to be able to do it, is also extracting references to papyri, to manuscripts, to fragments, of course, to archaeological and museum objects that you find aplenty in journal articles. But these are all things that, for now, I've not been doing. So I've been focusing on the first types of references. The nice thing that I really find exciting about canonical references is actually how they are interoperable ante litteram, so to say. They are a system that's been developed for the last, well, in the worst case, 300 years, perhaps. And in those 200-300 years, they haven't changed substantially. And not only they have remained stable across time, in different languages, they also work. Like you can see here, for example, you have a citation in Arabic, canonical reference in Arabic, and thanks a lot to Usama for actually I have no clue about Arabic whatsoever. So to helping me finding in a commentary about Aristotle reference in Arabic to it. And then you have just a reference in English. The canonical citation scheme used by the two is the same. Then it's translated in two different natural languages, but the citation scheme is the same. And it's the one established by Becker in the 1831 edition of the text. It's not logical, it's a specific printed edition that has been taken by scholars as a reference and then becomes a canonical citation scheme. But since new editions always refer, at least in the margins, as you can see here, they provide multiple canonical citation schemes, then these schemes remains somehow fixed and it still works. So I think that's a huge potential that we can exploit. When I started with this project, I thought all the canonical references are those that you find in the first example. So very structured list of references with clear abbreviations and syntax that you can very easily pass with regular expressions, and all works well. And then when I started digging more into the research, I actually realized that when you take a canonical reference, when you take the act of citing and referring, and you put it into the natural language, then all, not weird things, but all more complicated things start to happen. So you have, for example, in the second example, a passage that refers first to the Iliad and then to the Aeneid, and then cites passages from either of the texts. If you go sequentially, my software will look at the Iliad and say, okay, that's a reference to the Iliad, then one to the Aeneid, and then all the passages that follow, that must refer to the last encountered word, which is the Aeneid, which is the Iliad. But of course, this is not true, because they're referring to the Aeneid. So when you take them into the context of natural language, things become a bit more complicated. And then you have, of course, cases like when you have a reference plus a quotation, you give the quotation so you can be very concise and implicit about the reference. And all these things are very understandable and clear for a human reader, scholar, student. Student has to learn, but it's okay. It's part of the learning process. But for a machine, they become easily complicated. And that requires some processing, involving also some understanding of the context of where these references appear. I'm glad I don't have to go through this. I'm basically transforming any possible reference I encounter into a CTS-URL. So I'm actually, I'm not dealing with the exemplar part of the identifier, because what I'm interested in is just to know that it's a citation to Homer's Iliad. Then it's up to the reader, to the user, to resolve this citation to her preferred edition. But I just deal with a reference to authors, in this case Pliny, a work. Then you have a further level of granularity. You can have a CTS URL for the work, and then of course for the passage, so a specific passage, book, chapter, paragraph in Pliny's Naturalis Historia. The pipeline looks like this. You always start from just plain text input. There is then some pre-processing that involves a few things. So recognizing the language, because that's done automatically, splitting into sentences, splitting them into words, and then assigning part of speech text. Sentence splitting is something that looks very easy, and most of the time it is also easy. But when you start dealing with texts that are really full of citations and abbreviations, then even this task that for NLP people is just trivial, then becomes challenging. And in that case, it becomes very handy to have lists of abbreviations that you can incorporate, embed into the system. I decided to capture the sentences, nevertheless, because for me, they are a very important unit of context. So it makes a difference to know that this article cites Homer's Iliad and also the Aeneid, from being able to say, in this very sentence, two passages, one from the Iliad and one from the Aeneid, are cited together. And if you capture the sentence, then you can have this unit of information as part of your data. Then there is the extraction of references that I will explain now more into detail. And what you get at the end is just it's some annotated text where for each reference encountered in the text, you have assigned a CTS URL. So in order to be able to cope with this problem that I described before, of reference becoming more fuzzy in a natural language context, I decided to model them as a combination of entities, of named entities. So instead of modeling the reference as a one monolithic entity, I split it into components. And this makes it quite easy then to represent more complicated case where you have, like in this one, which is not very complicated, but already gives an idea. You have a reference to Pliny Naturalis Historia, two consecutive references. You mention only once the text you're referring to, and then you give two citation scopes. You say twice what you are referring to. If you model this as a monolithic entity, you cannot do it. But if you model it as citation components, and then you relate them by means of relations, then it becomes possible. And then capturing references just becomes a matter of assigning the right CTS URL to each mention of ancient author, like Homer, or mention of an ancient work, like Georgics, or mention of a canonical reference, which is a combination of a reference to an author or a work and a reference to what I call the reference scope, so the very text passage you are citing. And this entity, this hybrid entity reference to author or work, it's needed because you have tricky cases like Thucydides, when you give the name of the author, but what you really mean is the name of the work. So you're citing Thucydides, you're not citing the histories, even when you're citing the history. So you say Thucydides, but you mean his opus maximum, so the histories. So that's to capture those cases. The second step is to extract the relations between these citation components, and you have a combination of these four entities together. And then the last step, as I just said, is to assign to each reference a CTS URL. From the software point of view, it's not very complicated. You have a citation extractor that takes care of extracting the reference from the text, and then essentially the reference is split into two components. One is the reference to the work, and the other one is the reference to the passage. For the reference to the work, I try to disambiguate it for now, trying to look it up against a knowledge base that contains names and variants of authors, titles of works, abbreviations, and then for the reference scope, it's just a process of normalizing it, because you have, like in this case, 12.10f. You can't turn that straight away into a CTS. You have to spell it out and say, well, what it actually means. It's book 10, line 10 to book 12, line 10, and book 12, line 11. And this is done it's basically regular expressions normalizing this reference. One of the corpora I've been working with is JSON, that I'm sure you all know. I will come back to the language distribution in JSON later in the slides, but as you can see already, 75% of the content of JSON is in English. 138,000 articles at that time, 6 years ago, and now it's over 200,000, which quite a bit of data. So almost a billion tokens, from which I've extracted slightly more than 1.5 million of references. So that's one of the corpora I'm dealing with, and I will also present some examples drawn from this. So one of the possible uses of canonical references is to take them as traces of scholarly reception. So every time a scholar cites a text, is using it. At the most general level, we can say it's a sign of using that text. Since we are able, as I said at the beginning, since these references haven't changed much in the last 200, 300 years, and they also work across languages, this means that we can use them to study scholarly reception across time and languages. What I mean by scholarly reception, as opposed to literary reception studies more the influence of literary works on other literary works, like novels. Scholarly reception looks more at how scholars at different points in time have studied differently the same corpus of classic authors. So they are essentially traces of scholarship. There are not many examples of quantitative studies of scholarly reception in classics. One that I stumbled across really randomly, looking at the Wikipedia article about the Philology, is this study from the 90s from Walter Scheidel on continuity and change in classical scholarship. He hasn't used anything of what I'm talking about. He went to the Philology and manually took a sample of the data and looked and counted how many times there was an article being published and reviewed about Virgil, Homer, and all the other authors. And this allowed him to plot in this kind of vintage visualizations, but I'm not producing something very similar, very different, plotting some trends of reception over time for classical authors. He did it on a different set of data, so on the DNA Philology, and also looking at basically the subject classification assigned manually to each publication. What I'm doing is slightly different, also working on different data, and somehow I'm doing pretty much the same, but bottom up. So the same information that he was getting from the subject classification, I can infer that from the number of times a given text is cited. So what you can start doing, like in this example, is to take some authors and compare how the number of references these authors they get from JSON articles, how this varies over time. And you can, of course, compare this with literature, with studies of literary reception of these two authors. There is a very interesting study by Thomas Tsiolkovsky, an American comparative scholar, that has studied actually the literary reception of Ovid and Virgil. And you can start comparing and ask yourself if the dynamics of literary reception are similar to those of scholarly reception, and if you're actually able to capture them, starting from the data, not just starting from having a feeling about which periods were most Ovidian and which periods were most Eugenian. Another thing you can do, and I've done, and also compared to Scheidler's results, is to look at the top authors cited. So he did it for the année philologique, following his method. I tried to do the same, top 15 from JSTOR, bottom up, starting from the references and then inferring that information. What you get at the end, apart from the Plutarch anomaly, is basically the two sets of, the two lists overlap. The only difference is that Scheidel also has New and Old Testament that I'm not considering, but apart from that, that's the first sign that the two approaches, at least for that, for the canon, for the quantified canon, as I like to call it, they overlap. So this approach kind of works. And the interesting thing is also that 1% of the authors essentially captures 30% of the references I've cited from JSTOR. Plutarch, as I said, it's an anomaly. He will definitely going to be there even after cleaning the data, but there are some errors that boost a bit the signal of Plutarch in this example. The second thing that you can do is to use citations actually as an entry point to information to search through your JSTOR articles. One of the things that I did just as a demonstrator is to put together this small interface, this NAD in JSTOR, just to show what you can do once you extracted these references from JSTOR and how you can enable students and scholars to read somehow the text, combining distant and close reading. So the panel on the left-hand side is like a heat map showing the density of quotations and references for each chunk of the NAD. So the darker chunks, so they are all, I'm not sure if you can read it, but they are all 50 lines chunks of the text. The darker they are, it means they have a higher density of quotations and references. So the references come from my data. The quotations were set by the people at the JSTOR labs, looking at literally quotations of NAD in JSTOR articles. If you put them together, you get this kind of heat map, which is, for people that know the text, is not surprising, but already from afar tells us something about which parts of the text have been preferred target of scholarly reception for the NAD. Then you have in the middle column the text for reference, and then what you see on the right-hand side, once you click on a chunk of the text, then you get a list of articles extracted from JSTOR that either quote or refer to that text passage. And well, this is just for the NAD, but it's quite useful in terms of having instantly an overview of secondary literature about a primary text, and also being able to access it. Of course, this was just for the NAD. Doing it on Homer would be very interesting and not that difficult, at least for the reference extraction. Another thing you can do, since all this data it's available as a graph anyway behind the interface. For example, you can search for parallels, and one type of parallels that it's interesting to look at are, for example, intertextual parallels. So with this system, I'm not able to discern which parallels cited by a scholar are intertextual and which are not, but I can define a parallel as a co-occurrence of two or more references within a given context, and in my case, it's the sentence. That's why I'm capturing sentences. So one of the things you can do, for example, you can ask for all the articles discussing parallels between Virgilian and Homeric poems. This can be useful. Well, for example, if you are preparing a commentary, you want to check secondary literature, or if you get a possible parallel using a text reuse detection tool like Tessere, and you want to check if this parallel has been found by any chance by some other scholar in the last 200 years. I'm trying to expose this. Well, this is very much work in progress, and if you try the URL, it doesn't quite work, but as an API, so you can have interfaces built on top of it, but it's also a graph that you can search. And the search over the graph becomes very clear because you pass each URN of the passages you are interested in as a parameter, and then you query the graph, looking at documents that contain sentences that have one or more references to both of these texts, and then you get back the results. And the results you get back are quite interesting. So just some example of, well, this is a passage of a scene being modeled similarly between the Aeneid and the Odyssey. Under the hood, you have an API that returns some JSON with metadata about the article, metadata about the matching references, and you should be able to see the CTS URL for each reference, and then, of course, the text containing the context of this reference. I'm skipping a bit on the examples to move to the scenarios. So I think the first thing we can do, even before trying to extract references from more non-European languages, and also more European languages, apart from those I already covered, that are English, German, Italian, Spanish, and French, it's to foster some language diversity. As you can see, well, as I showed already, the language distribution in JSTOR, if you use JSTOR to study scholarly reception, then you get an image of one specific scholarship tradition, that is the Anglo-Saxon, mostly classical scholarship. If you want to broaden it up a bit, then you need to take into account more articles and possibly in more languages. I did the same language distribution for comparison using the Ancient World Online, so this great bibliographic resource covering open access journals from ISO, from Chuck Jones. This is a bit problematic. It's comparing the two is not that easy because in the case of JSTOR, I'm taking the language of each article. In the case of AWOL, I'm taking the language of the journal because we don't have yet the granularity of the article, but we might in the near future. So it's not that an easy comparison. But you can see already English decreasing, having more French, more Spanish, Portuguese popping up in the first 5 languages. So that's what we need to head towards, incorporating more open access electronic journals that are not in JSTOR, and also expanding, increasing the language diversity. This was a very timely tweet. This was, well, I posted a link to the interface asking for feedback on Twitter, this NND JSTOR that I just showed, and someone replied, well, I was asking feedback wanted on this display, and someone was saying, well, I need a Hebrew transliteration, proposal for localization. It's beyond the scope of what I'm doing, but it's telling us exactly we need to make it easier for people coming from other languages to get access to this data. So that's, I think that pretty much sums it up for me. One way of doing this with the citation data that I showed already is to have, or at least one way I can envisage beyond incorporating data from AWOL, for example, is to have a very basic user interface like this one, where you have a tree with cited authors, works, and passages on the left. And then when you select some of them, then you get results from JSTOR or whichever other data source. Like in this case, for example, it's showing a query for passages citing the Pentateuch of Thucydides. What I would really love to do is be able to display the same interface in many more languages, translating, instead of giving names of authors and titles of works just in English, giving it in a range of other European languages and non-European languages, like having this translated into Japanese, Arabic, Romanian. Just the student or the scholar will have any way to go and read a text in another language, but at least lowering a bit the barrier by providing a tree of the cited authors that speaks also in other languages. Using the canonical, using the knowledge base that I'm using to extract the canonical references, that's not too difficult to do. I won't go into too many details about this knowledge base, but essentially it's taking data from the process catalog, of course, taking data from the classical word knowledge base, from the Philology and Philology, putting them together, using as a standard a combination of CDOC CRM for the ontology and also for the U. And then I wrote a small bit of ontology which is called HueSite, to fill the gap to represent canonical references. The good thing of having the CWKB, but most importantly the process catalog data, is that from that we can quite easily go to VIAF and to Wikidata, and from those sources then we can fetch a lot of labels for authors and works in many more languages beyond those that I'm covering right now. I will skip these diagrams about the ontology. If you want to do the third scenario, which is adding more languages, so extracting canonical references from more languages, thing becomes a bit more difficult. To have more European languages, in addition to those that I have, it's not too complicated. Most of them are covered by the part-of-speech tagger anyway, which is a very important part of my pipeline. You just need to adjust a bit the knowledge base, so the bits highlighted in red, and some dictionaries of abbreviation that are passed to the system. So that's quite doable. If you want to extend this to non-European languages, like let's say I want to extract canonical references from text written in Arabic or Japanese, things are doable, becomes more difficult. You need to deal with a different sentence splitting and tokenization and part-of-speech tagging in other languages. You are likely to have in the input and output problems with right-to-left text. All these tools work with Unicode, but you never know if it's going to work also in your case. So covering, also expanding this to non-European languages is definitely desirable, but it's a bit more difficult. And that was it. Thank you.
Any quick questions for Matteo? We have a couple minutes, I think. Yes. I like Kira set up.
So Patrick Burns at ISOP. So one, thank you for using the AWOL index. It's a project I work on. So that's wonderful. So I want to just directly ask, what do you want language metadata in per article? Would that be helpful to this sort of thing?
Yeah, essentially one of the reasons for using JSON, it's because once you're able to get the data and sign you with your blood the license agreement, then it's you get data which are ready to process, metadata for each article, and then also data in a format that you can start right away. I think with AWOL you need to do a bit more pre-processing, or at least to get, having the JSON, it's a huge step forward from having just the blob, because it gets you data in a machine the readable way, and you can work with it. But then you need to, for example, parse for each journal, get the table of content, and then get articles. Essentially, I'm not really worried about information about the language, which I get automatically anyway. It's more the granularity of metadata for the single article, which is something that still is still not there. So there is a list of journals, but going from that to the metadata about the article, it's a bit of work.
It's getting better.
Yeah. Well, that would be awesome, because it's for me will mean I can, not stop, but I can continue working on JSON, but also expanding not just that, also things that are not in JSON, but they are in AWOL. And actually, what I've not done, but I would love to do, is to compare the list of journals. I don't know if you have any feeling, but between, for example, an Philologic, JSON, and AWOL, and see what is the overlapping. If some of the things in AWOL are also covered by JSON and Philologic, or if by hitting AWOL, you just hit a completely some kind of gray zone that is not covered by canonical resources. And in that case, it becomes even more important.